The future of work, as a speculative literature of fantasies and fears of what work might become, does not exist until the Tudor Poor Laws, written sporadically between 1485 and 1602. Work has a future, I want to suggest, only when the traditional world of work is earmarked for changes. In the social imaginary of the Tudor landowners, English society is under threat from the workless poor, particularly vagrants and beggars, who, it appeared, refused to work and therefore draw on the wealth of the nation without contributing to it. In a law passed in 1547, beggars could be enslaved for a period of 2 years and vagrants could be branded with the letter V and enslaved for life. Before this, in 1533, the first House of Correction was established using hard labour as a punishment for the workless poor driven to theft, idleness and prostitution, 2/3 of whom were female. The future of work is first conceived in the Poor Laws as an improvement of society by coercing the workless poor into productive employment. Improvement was becoming a leading idea. The 16th century saw traditional family subsistence farms being replaced in England by efficiently operated agrarian enterprises that raised productivity and extended cultivation with new agricultural techniques. By the end of this period, a vocabulary of improvement was used to describe the difference between traditional agriculture and capitalist farming. The Poor Laws could conceive of a dramatically different future for work for the first time, therefore, because of the success of capitalist farming. Before work had a future, it had its own utopia. The 14th century poem, The Land of Cockaigne, describes a place where larks smothered in stew fly down into open mouths and every man may drink his fill and needn't sweat to pay the bill. Cockaigne and its modern variants, including the bluegrass song, The Big Rock Candy Mountain, is a dream image of another place and elsewhere rather than a future without work. The same society that criminalized vagrants and beggars and dreamt of the land of Cockaigne had only negative meanings for work. Work was painful and troublesome. It had no value in itself but served only as a means to obtain financial or other wages. Work was above all understood as a form of subservience. It debased the person, ruined the body and dulled the mind. For the Tudors, the poor were divided into the able-bodied and the impotent. Later these were reconfigured as deserving and undeserving, the labouring poor and the idle poor, and in the 19th century, the respectable and the criminal poor. Helen Denby Bosanquet called the undeserving poor the industrial residuum. In an essay published in 1893, she argued that the poor bring poverty on themselves due to their bad character brought on by bad habits, bad attitude, bad parenting, bad company, bad education and bad role models. For her, the poor lacked everything that made the middle class morally, educationally and financially superior. The ideal economic man, she said, is remarkable for his foresight and self-control. In the residuum, these qualities are entirely absent. In place of foresight, we find the happy faith which never fails that something will turn up, and instead of self-control, the impulsive recklessness which may lead indifferently to a prodigal generosity or an almost inconceivable selfishness. The true type of this class lives in the present moment only, she said. Not only is he without foresight, he is almost without memory, in the sense that his past is so completely past that he has no more organised experience to refer to than a child. Hence, his life is one coherent jumble from beginning to end. It would be impossible to make even a connected story out of it, for every day merely repeats the mistakes, the follies, the mishaps of yesterday. There is no development in it all, she says. All is aimless and drifting. This account is less a description of the working class than an example of what Hayden White calls the technique of ostensive self-definition by negation. This technique operates in racist representations of people of colour, misogynist representations of women, colonial representations of the indigenous and straight representations of LGBTQ+. In this instance, middle-class virtue is reflected back in the residuum as vice, ability is reflected as incompetence, adulthood is reflected as childishness, generosity is reflected as selfishness, planning is reflected as chance, restraint is reflected as impulsiveness, caution is reflected as recklessness, and knowledge is reflected as ignorance. The history of the future of work from the 15th century to the late 20th century never even aimed for manual workers to become more intellectual, or even for the most part to become more skilled, but simply to work harder, be more disciplined, and to accept worse and worse types of work. It was only in the late 20th century that the advanced economies in Europe and North America began to compete with each other by having an increasingly educated and skilled workforce. Initially, though, the problem seemed only to be that some of the poor, when they possibly could, avoided backbreaking, tedious, dirty, badly paid work. In response to this problem, in France in 1611, 1612, 1617 and 1618, statutes were drawn up for the first time to authorise incarcerated criminals to be forced to work. The number of beggars and vagrants across Europe increased in the 17th and 18th century. In France, England, Ireland, the Netherlands, Germany and elsewhere, the official response to the growth of idleness was higher levels of imprisonment and the building of more and more workhouses. In these modern establishments, work was performed, as James Farr described it, as an exercise in moral reform and discipline. Designed to house beggars, the infirm, and the unemployed, including children, who were all regarded as idle, the punishment of hard labour and the workhouse gave a new meaning to work. Like the Tudor authorisation of enslavement as a punishment for vagrancy, coerced work was the cure for the choice not to work. In the workhouse, hard labour was conceived of as both punishment and redemption. Work for the first time was thought of as a moral tonic, albeit as a cure for the vices of the poor only, not as an ethical practice for the nobility or the genteel. James Farr adds that the workhouse had a third function. Forced labour was deployed as an economic instrument to remedy unemployment, as a laboratory for the development of factories, and as a cheap labour force driving down prices and driving down wages for workers outside the workhouse. Forced labour therefore became a means of depriving the deserving poor by punishing the undeserving poor. This is the origin of a future for work that has been neglected by contemporary theories of work, but has been part of the toolbox of governance ever since, and has been contested by activists involved in prison reform and the prison abolition movement, which regards forced labour by prisoners to be a modern form of slavery. This means there are two futures of work. There's either a radical and decisive change that abolishes prison labour, or there is no feasible future of work that does not include forced labour and labour as a punishment. The future of work was launched by the idle rich against the idle poor, but it was not long before the lower orders had their say on another future of work. In 1649, Gerard Winstanley and 14 comrades, who called themselves the True Levellers, but became known as the Diggers, published a pamphlet speaking on behalf of the servants, labourers, paupers, and economically unfree during a harsh economic depression that left the unemployed poor with nothing. They were called levellers because they engaged in the direct action of levelling the ground in order to grow food and live in small, self-sufficient agricultural communities growing carrots, turnips, and beans. One digger explained that there was no work, but rich men's hearts are hardened. They will not give us if we beg at their doors. If we steal, the law will end our lives. Faced with starvation, they began to dig up manure and sow corn upon the common waste ground. Winstanley said, "He that works for another, either for wages or to pay him rent, works unrighteously. But they that are resolved to work and eat together, making the earth a common treasury, doth join hands with Christ to lift up the creation from bondage and restores all things from the curse." The diggers gave work and the worker an entirely new perception. Winstanley's plan, if put into action by the thousands of workers who supported him across the country, would have eliminated hunger in England, would have developed agriculture and revolutionised land ownership. The movement was crushed by the army and the gallows, but the vision of an alternative future of working together and eating together was kept alive by succeeding generations of activists and radical thinkers. Winstanley, then, is a reminder that disputes over enclosures and commoning are not only disputes over territory and access to land, but also unnecessarily disputes over two futures for work, either to work together or to work for the benefit of others. John Locke's second treatise of government, published in 1689, has a reputation of being the first text of political theory to affirm work. Winstanley was earlier, but Locke wrote a treatise, not a pamphlet, and so he has taken all the credit. The historian Richard Tawney says, Locke merely poured into a philosophical mould ideas that had been hammered out in the stress of political struggles by people like Winstanley. Locke fundamentally rewrote the basis of the political organisation of society as arising out of natural and therefore Enlightenment principles in which labour was recognised as the origin of property and therefore civil society. Locke argued, as much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property. The catch, and what separated Locke from the diggers, was that as soon as work is converted into property, it could be disposed of or inherited by generation after generation in ways that excluded future generations of those who might till, plant, improve, and cultivate it. Also, Locke added the proviso that the work on the land needn't be executed by the person himself, but by someone paid to do so, and the rightful ownership does not belong to the worker but the employer. Here, the future of work is property, but the future is already sewn up in a mythic past that can no longer be changed. The only way that work can lead to property and wealth in the present and near future for him is on foreign lands that have not been converted into property yet. So work, property, and colonialism come to merge. In the decades that followed, the hostility to the idleness of the working class intensified. The Enlightenment challenged the moral universe of work inherited from classical scholarship by studying the technical division of labour, productivity and mechanisation, technology and technique. The first attempt to study the secrets of the mechanical arts was made by the Royal Society in 1660. John Evelyn, William Petty and Robert Hooke pioneered the study of techniques and processes, not always successfully overcoming resistance from handicraft workers themselves, while John Hinton's Universal Magazine of Knowledge and Pleasure set a new standard for the illustrated dissemination of trade secrets. The Enlightenment would continue to increase the esteem of labour, while at the same time despising workers and undermining their power and control over the work process. Diderot, for instance, argued that the mechanical arts were equal to the liberal arts, and the mechanical arts constituted the most extensive and original part of his encyclopedia. From the end of the 1740s to the 1760s, Diderot collected technical information from skilled workers, industry and scholarship to construct the first systematic understanding of the mechanical arts. As Celia Fox points out, this enlightened attentiveness to the methods and mechanisms of manufacturing intended to rid them of their mystery and power. James Farr explains that Diderot distrusted artisans as obscurantist, secretive, and ignorant guildsmen who jealously clung to obsolete modes of production. Indeed, the Enlightenment study of work was not only in praise of the creativity of the mechanical arts and the knowledge of nature that craftsmen possessed, but also to prize the vocabulary of the manual arts away from the domain of the workers, to change it, to bring it under control, and finally, to create a new language of the mechanical arts. If the Tudor Poor Laws speculated that society could be made more productive by forcing the idle to work, the Enlightenment study of industry believed that hard-working labourers could be made more productive by subjecting their work processes to the scientific scrutiny of genteel amateurs and bourgeois scholars. This process of rationalising the work process appeared to reach its conclusion in Fordism in the 20th century, but subsequent developments in robotisation, wearable technology, the Internet of Things, and the quantification of the self have taken this tendency to new heights, or new lows, depending on your point of view. The classic study of the Fordist division of labour is Harry Braverman's Labour and Monopoly Capitalism, published in 1974. Braverman charts the transition to modern factory production as the progressive alienation of the process of production from the worker. Braverman links the breaking up of the production process into simple, repeated tasks with the destruction of craft and the disempowerment of skilled workers. In general, he considers scientific management to be an assault on the worker both by reducing the labour technically and subjectively, which he calls the degradation of labour, and also by diminishing the worker's control over production, which he calls de-skilling. Braverman highlights the importance of the separation of the functions of conceptualization and execution, in which all possible brain work should be removed from the shop and centered on the planning or laying out department. This separation is a political division that opposes worker and management. Phoebe Moore, in her study of the neoliberal workplace, explains that scientific management undermined the tacit, qualitative knowledge that empowers workers and instead concentrates knowledge work within the planning division. The division of work process into precise tasks removed skill and tacit knowledge from the work process itself. Today, however, she says, the contemporary workplace uses tracking devices to extend managerial efforts to control and extract value from creative as well as physical labour in more precise, quantified ways. Whereas traditional Taylorism targets external performance within enclosed factories, contemporary technology allows control of micro-social and inner processes in open-ended working environments. Future research, she suggests, should identify an emerging digital double movement, like those seen in emergent practices of social movements, where individuals and groups respond critically to the problems arising out of modern post-industrial conditions to safeguard workers and the public against the dangers inherent in the digital quantification of work. Andrew Yore's Victorian fantasy of the factory proposes a different future for work. The perfect factory, in his description, was a factory without workers and therefore a factory without error, without illness, and no longer threatened by the disruption of insubordinate workers. The fully automated factory without workers is a boss's cocaine in which profit can be plucked from the air. Charles Fourier, at the same time, introduced the idea of attractive labour. Fourier continued to subscribe strictly to the concept of labour as an unpleasant hindrance, but believed that work could be made more attractive within an ideal community in which workers are associated, share the proceeds of labour in a rational manner, and have a variety of tasks to perform. Work becomes attractive, therefore, he argues, when the worker is no longer obliged to spend 12 and frequently 15 consecutive hours in some tedious labour. William Morris said the arts generate two types of pleasure. The first is derived from their use, principally in the beautiful decoration of well-made things, while the second consists in giving us pleasure in our work. Morris goes further than most commentators on the arts and crafts movement, saying, in a spirit close to the diggers, the first step towards making labour more attractive is to get the means of making labour fruitful, the capital, including the land, machinery and factories, into the hands of the community. Automation originated as a capitalist dream world of capital accumulation emancipated from labour, but it was soon taken up by socialists who saw in automation the promise of a mechanical cocaine. In my book, Art and Post-Capitalism, I call this faith in mechanization and automation the myth of technologies of rest. Oscar Wilde argued that it is mentally and morally injurious to man to do anything in which he does not find pleasure, and many forms of labour are quite pleasureless activities and should be regarded as such. This was satirical because it crossed the classic noble hostility to work with the decadence of aestheticism. He explained his point with the example of a road sweeper. To sweep a slushy crossing for 8 hours a day when the east wind is blowing is a disgusting occupation. Taking a pop at the advocates of the dignity of labour, he quipped, to sweep it with mental, moral or physical dignity seems to me to be impossible. To sweep it with joy would be appalling. Man is made for something better than disturbing dirt. All work of that kind should be done by machine. Here is Wilde's speculative hope for a future of work helped rather than hindered by mechanization. In 1930, the economist John Maynard Keynes predicted that technology and productivity will have developed so much by the time that his grandchildren were old enough to have jobs that they would need to work just 15 hours a week. Accordingly, to his calculations, given the rate of capital growth due to improvements in productivity and technology, it may be possible within a single lifetime to match current outcomes in agriculture, mining and manufacture with only a quarter of labour which has been previously required. And further down the line, he speculated, it would be possible to cut the working week to 15 hours if, as he assumed, the amount of work required for the reproduction of society is spread evenly amongst society. The great philosopher Bertrand Russell subscribed to the principle that the road to happiness and prosperity lies in an organised diminution of work, but also that modern methods of production have given us the possibility of ease and security for all, and if therefore we continue to work as hard as we did before there were machines, then we have been foolish, but there is no reason to go on being foolish forever. According to Russell, there are two types of idleness, two types of work, and three social classes. The two types of work, established two, of the three classes. The first consists of altering the position of matter, and the second consists in telling other people to do so, or if you prefer, altering the position of workers. The third social class lives off rent drawn from land ownership, and these engage in neither of the two types of work because landowners are idle. The book has the title In Praise of Idleness, but it is no endorsement of the landowning class. Russell explains, unfortunately, their idleness is only rendered possible by the industry of others. Indeed, their desire for comfortable idleness is historically the source of the whole gospel of work. The last thing they ever wished was that others should follow their example. When Russell advocated idleness, therefore, he was not speaking of an individual form of idleness that constitutes a privilege in relation to the waged and the salaried. Instead, he said, the road to happiness and prosperity lies in an organized diminution of work.